Hello, I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us once again, Professor William Black. He is an associate professor of both law and economics, also a former top banking regulator during the resolution trust days and the savings and loan crisis. A few years ago, he wrote a book called "The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One." Welcome to USA Watchdog, Professor Black.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Well, I just want to kind of start off with what's been going on in the financial system, and kind of an overview. A lot of people think everything's done, all the problems are over, everything's good, and then last month we hear Attorney General Eric Holder, who now admits there are, obvious crimes committed, what you've been talking about for years. And he doesn't want to prosecute these big bankers because, it could damage the national economy. Sounds to me the banking system isn't very stable, isn't very repaired, isn't really all that good. What do you think?
No, they've obviously set up the banking system in a way that it's going to continue to cause recurrent, intensifying financial crises that are going to be systemic and global in many cases. As you say, they've finally given up on the claim that this is the first virgin crisis conceived without sin in the banking sector, which was always a silly story. And a story that, by the way, was blown apart by the Frontline documentary, which confirmed from inside sources, former FBI agents, exactly what we've been saying for years. It isn't simply that they're not prosecuting, they are not investigating the largest banks. And none of these things came from investigations by the Justice Department. For example, the disclosure that HSBC, the largest European bank, was among other sins, and I mean that, among other sins, because the Brits have caught them in at least 8 other kinds of violations recently. But the ones that we eventually had dropped at our door were first that they were money laundering for the most violent drug cartel in Mexico. So this is a place that literally kills thousands, actually it kills tens of thousands of Mexicans, often after torturing them and then decapitating them. And this is our drug war, right? Our drug war destroys much of Latin America. So this bank, literally and figuratively has blood on its hands. Caught red-handed, and no one will be prosecuted. Not only will the bank not be prosecuted, no officer will be prosecuted, and no former officer will be prosecuted. Now remember, this started with the first lie of the Virgin Crisis, that the banks were pure and had stopped violating the law. Preposterous. But this is the second lie. The second lie is that we can't prosecute officers and former officers because if we did so, we would cause the financial system to collapse. Now, that is ludicrous.
And let me interrupt you that's the same thing they said about HSBC. They said that not only did they launder money for Mexican and Colombian drug cartels, but also for countries on the terror list, like Iran. And they said the reason why they didn't prosecute him because they might cause damage to the financial system, just like Eric Holder. So now they're telling us, we have to live with this fraud because, we don't want to implode the system. Which brings me to my real question, and that is, if the system is that insolvent and that tenuous that we cannot prosecute for obvious massive crime, then it must be a teetering on the edge of collapse. To your point, I want you to hit on this intensifying systemic problems. Is this adding to the intensifying, getting worse, not getting better, banking problems in the world?
Right. So this is a whole series of lies, right? The first lie is that if we prosecuted the individuals, the institutions would collapse. There's just no truth to that. It's silly. When they say that type of thing, journalists should laugh in their face, and it should be on the nightly news. It should be on Jon Stewart and Colbert as these idiots saying things like that. That's just outright preposterous. The second thing is, and I've said this time after time, apparently regulators, our successors, are much more financially sophisticated than we are, because we had never thought that the way to financial stability was leaving felons in charge of our largest financial institutions. We were nowhere near that clever, right? So it is facially preposterous that you would leave felons in charge of your financial institutions. The third level of insanity in all of this is, well, wait a minute. If we not only can't prosecute them, then this means that definitionally, because the theory is will cause the failure of the institution, then that must be because facts would come out in the course of the trial that would cause people to say, we will no longer deal with this kind of institution. And that therefore we must prevent the public from learning about how perfidious the banks are. And again, that's a level of insanity. Now they tell us instead, don't worry, we don't need to prosecute people anymore. We'll just, because we get such huge fines. But remember, they're telling us that completely in the context that these are institutions that are systemically dangerous institutions, that when, not if, the next one fails, there's going to be a global financial crisis. That's what they're telling us. That's why they say we have to destroy the rule of law, that justice will no longer be blind, that it will look, and if it sees a big banker, justice will back off, right? That our whole statute, our whole system of justice, crony capitalism to the end has to come in. Well, if that's true, then by definition, the fines have to be trivial relative to the institution size.
And they are.
Otherwise, they cause the failure. And by definition, they told us they couldn't do anything that would even remotely risk the failure. So you know that these numbers are all calculated to be at levels that will cause no serious pain, and then are just ginned up in the usual PR way to make it sound like the Justice Department is being successful. But then your next point, forget financial stability, right? Forget fairness. This is an institution, the largest financial institution in Europe, that was dedicated to helping Iran develop a nuke. Forget financial instability. This is insane that we have banking institutions that absolutely care nothing about human beings. They don't even care about profits for the bank. They only care about their bonuses for the individual officers who control the bank. And this reads like those really bad novels at an airport, when you're exhausted out of your mind and you can only use 10% of your brain. And then you read some weird conspiracy thing about the banks did this and the banks do that. Well, here they really did. I mean, they really helped the most violent drug cartel in Mexico launder funds, knowing that it would produce thousands of murders and that it would corrupt the government of Mexico and other countries, including the United States. They really did help Iran evade sanctions designed to prevent them from developing a nuke. And they really did help evade sanctions to get money to Al-Qaeda, right? So I mean, this is like the reverse trinity of all that is unholy in modern banking. It reads like a bad novel, but it's true. And of course it's going to be true, because if you allow people to commit crimes with impunity and to have the officers grow incredibly wealthy and have impunity themselves, impunity even when they resign and leave, then you will create a criminal class and you will create massive criminal entities known as the largest financial institutions in the world. So this is insane. As soon as the Frontline documentary came out, Lanny Brewer, the head of the criminal division, who has been leading this fight for immunity, along with Timothy Geithner, both of them took off. Brewer is already back shilling how he'll be a great defense lawyer for the white-collar criminals and such, and his salary is reputed to be $3 million. So the revolving door, we've gotten rid of the mechanical one, and we have created a wonderful super engineered revolving door that shoots these guys out in nanoseconds and makes them fabulously wealthy.
Well, let's talk about the instability then of the banking system. And I looked at this amazing fact at the FDIC, $10.8 trillion on deposit and $33 billion in the deposit insurance fund. This is as of a few weeks ago. And they're quick to point out they have $100 billion line of credit to the Treasury, which, okay, so you have $130 to insure $10,800 of risk. It just doesn't sound very stable to me. And if you take a look at the news, the ongoing news out of Cyprus and Angela Merkel wanting more, bail-ins, they want to confiscate wealth, all these plans up in Canada, and if they protect your money and have capital controls and don't let you take it out, is your money really protected? So my question to you is the American banking system at risk for another meltdown? And if so, how soon? How shaky is it? It is shaky. How shaky is it?
Well, the U.S. banking system is absolutely primed for the next meltdown for the reasons I've just been discussing. You can't have a criminal class and criminal enterprise. So a group of three very conservative finance scholars have just published a month and a half ago a study that demonstrates, again, what we've been saying, but the word they use is pervasive, and they demonstrate pervasive fraud, and I swear to you, they don't have a sense of humor, they're finance profs, at what they term our most reputable banks. Now, I don't know how you can be pervasively fraudulent and most reputable, but, in the Valley of the Blind, perhaps this is the theory, that if they're only looting us and not funding Al-Qaeda, they're reputable banks. Anyhow, yes, the U.S. financial system is sick, and we still have this fundamental dynamic. And the fundamental dynamic is the regulatory race to the bottom. And so this is the biggest banks put us in competition, particularly with the City of London, to who will have the weakest regulation, and then they move their operations to wherever they will have the weakest regulation. And the place that won the competition in laxity was the City of London. Now, obviously, you can't win a competition that is a race to the bottom. So win should be in quotation marks. But that's why you see time after time, LIBOR scandal, HSBC, Standard Chartered, and a whole host of things that don't make the American press, but do make the UK press, that we are getting scandal after scandal after scandal of obscene levels out of the United Kingdom. And it doesn't just ruin the United Kingdom. Everybody that engages in that race ends up removing the regulatory cops in the beat. If you get rid of the cops in the beat, then cheaters prosper, and we call it a Gresham's dynamic in economics and criminology and in regulation, in which bad ethics drives good ethics out of the marketplace. Let me address directly your point about deposit insurance in the United States. That is not the concern, right? So with our insurance fund in the savings and loan crisis, we had $6 billion in the till, and we had $150 billion in liabilities. Now, obviously, that's not going to work. And by the way, the Reagan administration refused to allow us to draw on that line of credit, the analogous line of credit back in the day. But at all times, the U.S. Treasury stands behind. And so the U.S. Treasury is going to pay the insurance obligation. So people shouldn't be yanking their money out of U.S. banks. That is not the case in Europe. And you are quite right that Angela Merkel has wanted many people to take haircuts in connection with the failures of the banks. That in itself is not a crazy idea.
But what happens if one of these big banks go under and the Federal Reserve taps the Treasury and the government to, print all this money? Doesn't that hurt the money? We have a systemic crash where it's well beyond, the 130 billion credit line and the insurance fund, and it's an immediate, like the last crisis, $16.2 trillion. And we had to move from gold from 800 to 16 or 19, and now it's back to something like 14. So, I mean, at some point, doesn't the money printing to backstop all this hurt the money?
No, not in the realistic circumstances that you're talking about, but you are certainly correct. You can imagine if we let this go on for 40 or 50 years and we come back and do this same talk, assuming we're alive, and by then the size of the losses, the size of the bubbles we'll create, could in fact pose real existential threats. And indeed, there were real existential threats to Ireland and Iceland in this current crisis. You almost eliminated those nations as modern states. But here's the key difference. The United States isn't remotely like Europe. We're not remotely like Greece. We have a sovereign currency. The critical mistake that the Eurozone nations made was to give up a critical aspect of their sovereignty, which was their own currency. As soon as you do that and you get into a recession, then you are completely subject to the mercies of what even the IMF calls the bond vigilantes, right? And the bond vigilantes are looking to crush a currency, and you can get in a death spiral in which they attack a currency, the credit rating falls on that currency, so the interest expense goes up on that currency, so the deficit goes up to pay for that new higher interest rate, which causes a credit rating downgrade of the country, and you can see how this creates a death spiral type of thing. The United States is not subject to that because it has a sovereign currency, and we only borrow in our own currency, and we have freely floating exchange rates. So people don't have to worry about the United States going the same way as the euro, and we're nothing like Greece. That doesn't mean that it's just fine, right? The critical thing is how much we lose in the next bubble and disaster. So we already have ballpark for, and since 2007 and 8, we have millions. Collectively, we have 10 million Americans who should be working who are not working. And that is an enormous loss economically in stuff that's not being produced, but it's also really bad for people. For example, my wife does family law research as a professor, and it turns out that guys who are unemployed have much more time, right? They actually do less housework than guys who are employed. People don't react well to losing their jobs, and males in particular get very dysfunctional without jobs. So you can create so many dislocations in the economy that you can cause easily with this kind of banking crisis, Great Depression level. And by the way, if we adopt austerity, a la Europe, hey, we can have ourselves a second recession, within months. And Obama and the Republicans are both headed in the direction of austerity. So, the whole Eurozone crisis right now, which I call the Uber depression, people forget. Unemployment levels right now in much of Europe are higher than during the Great Depression. And they have only imposed sort of moderate austerity. If they impose the kind of austerity, for example, that FDR did in 1937 when he listened to his very conservative economic advisors, that'd be somewhere in the order of magnitude of 4 or 5 times more severe. So you can produce, as I say, depression. The Europeans have just shown that. Places like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, they're not in recession. They're in Great Depression levels of unemployment. In fact, several of those nations appear to be 2 to 3 times higher than the Great Depression levels of unemployment.
And in closing here, back in the United States, we are not out of the woods. The financial system is not fixed. It's shakier than ever, in your opinion.
We left the felons in charge and we made them rich and said, hey, you have immunity. That is the single craziest policy. I'll tell you one. Try to embarrass the administration, developed the phrase, I don't claim I'm the only one, that said, too big to prosecute. But they adopted it, as you say. Holder went and said they're too big to prosecute. They're not capable of embarrassment.
Dr. William Black at University of Missouri, Kansas City. I forgot I left off the university you were at the beginning at your introduction. Thank you so much for coming on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you so much. Take care.